Hi everyone, I'm Roy. I'm a PhD candidate at Technion, supervised by Itay. I'm here to present our joint work with Itay Tsabary and Alex Manuskin, both graduates from the Technion. Many prominent smart contract applications rely on timely confirmation of transactions for their security. For example, the Lightning Network and the Layer 2 protocol Arbitrum. However, transaction confirmation times can be volatile, resulting in security risks, including loss of funds. We present LedgerHedger, a smart contract to allow a user to reserve an allocation for a future transaction from a miner at a predetermined price. We show LedgerHedger incentivizes both the user and the miner to agree on and complete the reservation. In addition, we implement our solution on the Gerli testnet and show its overhead cost can be more than an order of magnitude smaller than the reservation. So in this talk, first I'll talk about some background, talk about blockchain transactions and smart contracts. Then I'll present our challenge, which is timely confirmation of transactions. I will talk about previous solutions and their shortcomings, and explain LedgerHedger, our solution. Then I'm going to talk about the analysis we perform, which is split into two parts. First, showing that parties initiating a LedgerHedger contract will follow through with the contract, and second, showing that users will benefit from initializing the LedgerHedger contract in the first place. Lastly, I'm going to talk about implementation of LedgerHedger, which we did in Solidity in a testnet, and we're going to see the overhead costs it has. Okay, so let's start with the background. A blockchain is a chain of blocks. Each block points to the previous one. In every blockchain, you have some entity, a miner, proposer, or a validator, or it goes by other names, an entity which is responsible to create new blocks. Blocks contain transactions. In early iterations of blockchains, transactions were just payments of tokens between one user to another. But in newer iterations, you have smart contracts, where these are stateful programs on top of the blockchain, and they can control tokens. Smart contracts allow users to interact with them using predefined functions and can implement any business logic. Therefore, in a smart contract blockchain platform, you can have mixed transactions. Some transactions are calls to functions, and some are payments between users. Now, to issue a transaction, a user has to create a data structure, sign it digitally, and transfer it over the peer-to-peer network to a miner, which will include it in a block. To incentivize the miner, the user has to pay some fee. And this results in a fee market. Miner can only include so many transactions in a block, so he will prioritize transactions which pay him more. This results in a lively fee market, which allows users to signal miners to prioritize their transactions by paying more. Now, in smart contracts, it's more tricky because contracts have functions which can require large amounts of computation. It makes sense to measure how much computation a function requires and charge it accordingly. Therefore, a user has to specify how much he's willing to pay per unit of gas, where gas is the measure of the computation. And miners will prioritize higher transactions which pay a higher gas price. Now, to our challenge. A lot of smart contract applications rely on timely transaction confirmation. In particular, I want to focus on scaling solutions such as payment channels, optimistic rollups, and zero-knowledge rollups, for which there are many examples of. All of these require periodic updates of their state through a transaction on the blockchain. And more specifically, payment channels and optimistic rollups are also secured using timely confirmation. They both exhibit some behavior where you have two or more users interacting off-chain, where one side can go rogue and try to do something bad. In these applications, it takes two transactions to steal funds. First, the user has to prepare the theft, and this opens up a time window after which the user can steal all funds and run away with the money. And both of these applications are secured by the other party monitoring the blockchain and seeing whether this example, the blue user is trying to steal the funds. In this case, the orange user will insert a transaction to stop this. And this will prevent the blue user from stealing the gas, from stealing the funds. And this is essentially the way optimistic rollups and payment channels are secured today. If we go back a moment to talk about the fee market, where miners prioritize larger paying fees, this can become a problem if a network is congested. A lot of users are issuing transactions which they want to be on the blockchain. And if in that case the user, which we just saw, has to issue the stopping transaction, he will have to pay a lot to get it on the blockchain. And this happens often. The gas price is very volatile. Here you can see the gas price, the daily average of the gas price over the past 6 months. There are periods where the gas price is low, but it can easily double within a day or so. So our idea is to mitigate the volatility by hedging. The user will pay a lot to get the user might pay a lot to get his transaction on chain, but by hedging it, he reduces the risk. So let's talk about previous solution. In traditional markets, you have what is called a forward contract. A buyer and a seller agree at a certain time to make a purchase of some commodity at a certain price in a future date. And this requires enforcement. In the future date, the market price of the commodity will change. And either the buyer will have to overpay because he will pay the predetermined price, or the seller will get less money than what he was supposed to. So you need enforcement to ensure that both the buyer and the seller will go through with the contract at the future date. In blockchain, it's not trivial to do so. Therefore, the only alternative that we found was gas tokens. And this the idea is to buy these gas tokens in advance and then sell them when you want to issue a transaction, and they will refund you for some amount of gas. And these are split into two categories. The first one is ones based on the refund mechanism in Ethereum, where you can create these tokens by expanding gas on storing arbitrary data, and then you can delete this data to get a gas refund. So if you attach this into a transaction which costs a lot of gas, and within that transaction you also delete the data, you get some refund on the gas. But this is inefficient. Only about a third of the gas is refunded. And also, this is obsolete now, as of August 2021 in the London hard fork. So these don't work anymore. The other type of tokens are oracle-based tokens, where you peg a synthetic token to the gas price using an oracle. But using an oracle means that this token is susceptible to various DeFi attacks and manipulations, such as front-running, liquidations, and so on. As of EIP 1559, there's a new opcode which allows a smart contract to query for the current gas price in the block. But even if you do this, or use an oracle to get an estimate of the gas price, you need to sample it over some period. If this period is too short, it might become too easy to manipulate. And if the period is too long, it can cause the gas price to be inaccurate or stale. So it's still tricky even if you have the new opcode. Okay, so now let's talk about our solution. Our solution try to imitate what happens in a forward contract, but without the external enforcement. In this case, the buyer and the seller each create a sort of forward contract within a smart contract, and they agree that the seller will include a buyer's transaction at a future date. It is natural that the seller would be a miner because the miner will know he will have a gas allocation in the future. But it doesn't have to be a miner, it could be any entity willing to take on that risk. And then to pay at the future date, the seller will have to pay some miner to get the transaction on chain. Okay, so LedgerHedger operates in two phases. First, the setup phase, and then the execution phase. And these are set by fixed block numbers. Okay, I'm going to go through how LedgerHedger works. So first, in the setup phase, the buyer initiates a new contract. At this stage, the buyer sets all the parameters of the contract. When is the execution phase, how much money he will pay for the seller, what's the size of the gas allocation, when is the future allocation supposed to be, and so on. The buyer also sends some money. He sends a payment to be given to the seller for giving the gas allocation and a tip, which I'll touch on in a moment. The seller has to accept the contract by sending some collateral, and this amount is defined by the buyer. The seller has to send his collateral to the smart contract. By doing so, he accepts the contract, and now we don't do anything and move on to the execution phase. In that phase, the buyer can send a transaction to the seller. That transaction could be anything. In particular, for example, it could be a periodic update of some layer 2, where the buyer sends a transaction to the layer 2 smart contract, the orange contract, which is different from the LedgerHedger contract. Just wanted to emphasize that. Okay, so the buyer sends a transaction to the seller, and the seller issues it on the blockchain through the smart contract with a technique called meta transactions in Ethereum. So by doing so, the smart contract can see that the seller issued the buyer, inserted the buyer's transaction into the blockchain, and the contract pays the seller everything: the payment, the tip, and the collateral. This works great if the buyer sends the seller a transaction, but what happens if the buyer disappears? For example, if now the market price for the gas price is very low, the buyer might not want to use LedgerHedger now. In this case, the seller can exhaust the contract to unlock to get his collateral back. So if he exhausts the contract, means that he has to issue a transaction which wastes all the gas allocation, all the reserved gas. But by doing so, he gets the payment and the collateral back. The tip will stay in the contract and will essentially be burnt. No one will be able to get it out of the contract ever. And of course, the seller can exhaust the contract even if the buyer sends him a transaction. That happens off-chain. The smart contract is not aware of that. And we have to make sure that it doesn't happen. That's what the tip is for. The tip is an extra amount given to the seller if he includes the transaction. So we wouldn't be incentivized to exhaust the contract if we can insert a transaction. Okay, so now let's talk about our analysis of LedgerHedger. First, we're going to talk about the follow-through. We want to make sure that the buyer pays the seller and that the seller will include the buyer's transaction. And second, we're going to talk about the benefit of using LedgerHedger. Why should the buyer initiate a contract and the seller accept it in the first place? So now let's take a short break and play a game. Okay, let's play tic-tac-toe. I'm X and I just made my move. You have to decide which move you want to make. Think about it for a moment. Okay, so let's consider what happens if you do the right move by playing circle on the middle left. Okay, so let's put it here for now. I'll denote the circle on top to say you are the last to make that move. And in this case, I have two options. I can play, not two options, I have many options. Two of them are what I just showed. I can play on the top left or on the top center, for example. Let's see what happens if I play the first one. In this case, you have two options. You can either block me on the bottom right or not. If you don't block me, you lose. So I guess you're gonna block me. You should block me. In this case, again, I have many moves. Let's focus on these two. So I can play the top right, or I could play the top center. Okay, let's say I do the first one. Now here you also have two options. You can essentially not block me on the top bottom left. In this case, you lose. Or you could block me there, but then I'm gonna win that on the top row, so you lose either way. Okay, so this is the entire game tree which we build. These two leaves uh, result in a win for me. So if you go one move back, you can see that in this case I will choose this move. If I reach this state, I will choose this action because it forces a win. So you know that I will use my chance to do that if I get that. Also, we have this leaf, which results in a win, and the state I just talked about, in which I can force a win. So if we go one step back again, we can see that if we get to this uh, this state, I will play the top left. In this case, you can see that no matter what you do, once I reach this state, I can force a win. And if I'm a rational player and I want to maximize my winning chances, I will do this if necessary. So we can go one step back and ask you, which move should you play? We just showed that the right move, I can force a win in that one, so it can be optimal, so you should probably pick the left one. And what we do in Ledger, the analysis of LedgerHedger is essentially the same. We build the entire game tree where a buyer can initiate a contract or not, the seller can accept that contract or not accept it, and once you have initiated an accepted contract, the buyer can publish a transaction or not, and the seller can choose what to do with the transaction. He can insert it into a blockchain, he can exhaust the transaction, and he can also ignore everything, ignore LedgerHedger, and lose his collateral. Okay, so let's focus on the execution phase, right? What we did before was called backward induction. You go from the leaves to the root. So let's go to the leaves. And what we show in our analysis, I'll make this rather briefly, but first let's focus even more. In the case that the buyer already sent a transaction, we already have an initiated contract, the buyer sent a transaction, the seller will want to confirm it if the collateral is high enough. We get a condition of how large the collateral should be using in this stage. Now, he will prefer to confirm a transaction rather than exhausting because he gets the tip. And if the collateral is large enough, he would prefer to confirm it over ignoring it, otherwise he would lose the collateral. Okay, so going one step backward, the buyer already sent the payment during initialization and he will not get that payment back. So there's no harm in sending a transaction. There's no reason not to because that's free for him. He can only benefit from having the transaction. Therefore, once the contract is initialized and accepted, everyone will follow through with the reservation. Now, let's talk about the second half of our analysis, the benefit of using LedgerHedger. Let's go back to the game tree and focus on the setup part. We know that if the contract is initialized and accepted, everyone will follow through. So we also show then that the buyer will be incentivized to initiate the contract and then the seller will be incentivized to accept it depending on several conditions. And I'm going to list them quickly and then we're going to go over each one. So first, it depends on the risk aversion of each party. Second, it depends on the gas price volatility. And third, it depends on the overhead to create the contract. We're going to go over all of them one by one. Let's start with risk aversion. And for that, let's play another game. Let's say you have $1 and you can, if you want, pay that dollar to me. I will roll a 100-sided die, and if it falls on 1, you win $100. Otherwise, you get nothing. Would you play this game? Okay, so if you only consider the expectation of playing this is 0. So if you risk neutral, you might want to play this, you might not, you don't really care because it doesn't change your expectation. But if you're risk averse, you will be inclined to avoid this risk of gambling. A player could also be risk seeking. He would prefer to risk his money to gain a big jackpot, for example. Okay, and this is modeled in standard literature. This is modeled in the economic literature like this. You have a function. The utility function of a player depends on how many tokens he gets. And for a risk neutral player, this function will be linear. If you have twice as many tokens, you're going to be twice as happy. For a risk averse player, this function will be concave. If you get twice as many tokens, you're going to be happier. You'll have more utility, but not twice as much. It's going to be less than twice as much. And standard functions for mimicking this is for modeling this is the square root function and the log function. Okay, so this is for risk aversion. We're going to use this function in a moment. Let's talk about the gas price model. So to understand the gas price model volatility, we have to understand the model behind it, and we model it as a Gaussian random walk, meaning that the gas price now plus the gas price at any step will be the gas price at the previous step plus some sample from a normal distribution. This is a random walk price model, standard in the economic literature. We also estimate its parameters using Ethereum data, using a month of samples, which is about 200,000 blocks. So in this plot, you can see that we took different windows, and for each window, we calculated the mean and the variance. And this is a histogram of the mean and variance combinations we have with respect to the windows, like how many windows resulted in an estimation of this mean and variance. And you can see that most of them are for a mean centered around 0, and the variance is usually somewhere between half and 1. We also do a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to show that the gas price differences are distributed normally, and we use the estimates from this graph to calculate the volatility. Now it means that the longer time frame you take, the more variance you have. The variance grows linearly with the time frame. So now let's take a look at this graph. The y-axis will be either the maximum price a buyer will willing to pay, or a minimum price the seller will be willing to get. In LedgerHedger, assuming we started at a price of 100 at the setup phase, and I'm talking about the price for the gas in the contract. Now we split this for different periods of time, and for the buyer and the seller, we have three options for the risk averseness, either risk neutral or a log function or a square root function. And you can see that the more uncertainty there is, the longer time frame you have, and the more risk averse a player might be, the more he's willing to wiggle with the price, either lower or higher, depending if it's a buyer or seller, to eliminate the risk. Okay, so this is without friction though. Now we implement LedgerHedger. This is an example of the exhaust function we have. We had to figure out how to burn exactly the right amount of gas. We deploy it on Gerli. We calculate the amortized gas cost for doing the different functions, applying the you can see that the overhead will be around 100,000 if you call two of these functions, but the reservation could go up to 30 million gas, which is the block limit in Ethereum. Now, this is the graph we had before. If we do consider friction, there will be a gap, but in a long time frame, it will still be beneficial to use LedgerHedger. Okay, so to conclude, we show LedgerHedger, a smart contract for a future transaction inclusion at a predetermined fee. We analyze it, show it's secure, and show it is effective with a low overhead. And this resolves the prevalent issue of unjustified reliance on fee stability. We have a link to the paper here. Thank you very much and have